Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a few seconds until we have most attendees coming in. We're going to have a very large crowd here. So I'm just waiting for the number of participants to take up here. All right, well, we're getting there. Good evening, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm delighted to host this evening's program on behalf of our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. Tonight, we are welcoming Greg Melville and Beverly Lucas for a discussion of Greg's book, Over My Dead Body, Unearthing the Hidden History of America's Cemeteries. I'll be introducing our guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. We encourage you to have conversation in the chat along with our guests. If you have a specific question for Greg and Beverly, you can go ahead and post that directly into our Q&A section for the end of the program. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. Now that I've said all that I want to get down, let's formally introduce our guests for tonight. So our moderator is Beverly Lucas. She's the director of Cedar Hill Cemetery Foundation in Hartford, Connecticut. She manages public programming, development, marketing, and preservation activities at the historic cemetery. Prior to Cedar Hill, she worked in the museum field, including at Connecticut Landmarks and Wethersfield Historical Society. Our author is Greg Melville. He has worked as an outdoor journalist and a former editor at Men's Journal and Hearst magazines. His writing has appeared in Outside, National Geographic Traveler, Men's Health, and the Boston Globe magazine. His work was also listed in the Best American Sports Writing 2017. He is a decorated veteran who served in Afghanistan and is in the Navy Reserve, where he is a public affairs officer with the rank of lieutenant commander. He has taught English and writing at the United States Naval Academy, where he was given the school's Instructor of the Year award in 2019. And he also teaches journalism at St. Michael's College in Vermont. So please sit back and enjoy, and don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A. Greg and Beverly, I will turn this over to you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So I guess I am the one to get us started. So my first question to you, Greg, is I guess you need to tell everybody how you became interested in cemeteries. As a staff person of a cemetery, I know I get that question a lot, and I'm sure you do too, but kind of what inspired you to start visiting cemeteries?
Sure. First, I do want to thank the Mark Twain House for having this event, which is just awesome. I'm excited to be here. And Beverly, also, thank you so much for participating in this. The Cedar Hill Cemetery Foundation is an amazing organization that does a lot of good work and keeps Cedar Hill Cemetery afloat. So thanks for the work you do as well. As far as how I got interested in cemeteries, it really started when I was, I guess, going into my senior year of college. I got a job in my town in Bedford, Massachusetts, working for the Department of Public Works, and largely what my responsibilities were to mow the large town cemetery and to occasionally dig graves. And during that time, I really gained a interest and appreciation for cemeteries. Before that, I just thought of them as burial grounds. And I didn't realize what amazing stories cemeteries told and how they all unfolded for me that summer working in that cemetery in Bedford, Massachusetts, really kind of sparked a lifelong interest in cemeteries. And that's pretty much it.
Okay. So I know the book just came out, so a lot of our listeners probably haven't had a chance to read it like I have. But Over My Dead Body, Unearthing the Hidden History of America's Cemeteries kind of focuses on lots of different cemeteries throughout the US. And each chapter kind of focuses on a cemetery, but then kind of takes it into a story that you may not expect. Some stories are positive, like cemeteries are public parks and setting for public art. Some stories are tragic, like the unknown whereabouts of the vast majority of those who died enslaved in America, or the discrimination or segregation of burial grounds. Others are just strange, like a cemetery acquiring a dead celebrity to increase demand. And then some are very intriguing, like Colonel Elmer Ellsworth and the Rise of Embalming. So what was one of the most inspiring or interesting stories that you discovered, and how did you select which stories to tell?
Well, I guess it's hard to choose which one of the 16 chapters basically I found most compelling. I have to say that when I was doing research for this book, I was just blown away by how little has been told of the stories of cemeteries. And so what I really tried to do for each of the locations that are highlighted within the book is find cemeteries that specifically either mirrored American history in a really important way, or actually played a role in shifting American history. They really, I wasn't looking for cemeteries to tell the story about necessarily the people who were resting inside them, but more about the cemeteries themselves as these living, evolving, beautiful individual creations that that tell their own long and compelling story.
Mm-hmm. So any ones that stand out as kind of the most intriguing to you or interesting? Or I know I had some that I found fascinating, but.
Okay. My personal favorite is probably, there are a couple. There's Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is just this amazing repository of art, which is in a lot of ways very similar to Cedar Hill, and was created around the same time in the middle of the 19th century in the rural cemetery movement. And it was really kind of served as one of the first, if not the first, public art museum in the country. And it continues that artistic tradition today. And then I also really like Hollywood Forever Cemetery out in Los Angeles because it's so eclectic, and it has had such a long and sordid history. And what the cemetery is doing these days to try and stay relevant in a time when digital memorialization is probably more relevant than analog memorialization in cemeteries. So they've really become a place where people go for date night, which is really interesting to see a movie or something like that. So those are the two that really jump out at me. But honestly, going through the list, Tombstone, Arizona, Boot Hill is just so fascinating. And the story that it tells there about the Chinese American immigrants who helped build the West, or frankly, the enslaved people's cemetery at Monticello, which is so symbolic of so many cemeteries that have been, frankly, erased in our history. And those are the ones that jump out to me right off the bat.
Right. Yeah, I have to admit, I thought Boot Hill Graveyard was fascinating, partly because, you know, I kind of know the rural cemetery movement story a lot more. And the fact that there's all these great epitaphs there and stuff, but then you really found that the Chinese immigration story, that you were able to really come up with something that most people would not have thought of when they were visiting that cemetery. When you've got people who are hanged, and even though they didn't do it, and things like that.
Yeah, and that's the fascinating thing about cemeteries is that no matter how history is written, there is this physical record that is kept at cemeteries of our history that is plain to see if you look for it. And oftentimes what I found is that it records a lot of hidden or unknown or overlooked or intentionally buried parts of our history. And cemeteries, I could go through the list, like you said, the first city park, the first natural conservation project with Emerson and Thoreau in Concord, Massachusetts, the first expression of freedom of religion in the country, the first suburban subdivision, the first art museum, the Forest Lawn Memorial Park was the first theme park in America, the most popular tourist destination in California for 3 decades until Disneyland came along, which modeled its layout after this cemetery. Just these fascinating stories that came to light.
Yeah, so that reminds me. So you did go in pursuit of Walt Disney, but you don't seem to be the type that look for all the famous people, which we definitely. Katharine Hepburn's buried at Cedar Hill, so we get a lot of people who gravitate towards her.
Right.
So did that just not make the book that all the other people that you were fanning over, or did you really only Walt Disney?
No, that's a good question. So I know this sounds to my Naval Academy students who are listening right now, this will sound familiar to them, and you are listening, right? But anyway, I really wanted cemeteries to be the protagonist of the story because we have so many travelogues and frankly, even books about where to visit people's graves. But what I thought was untold were the cemeteries themselves. And originally, and it was really difficult to figure out how to do that. But originally I did have like these, I tried to include individual graves that people should visit. And I tried to put it after each chapter, but it kind of broke up the flow. And I felt it took away from the story of the cemeteries themselves, if that makes any sense. So
Definitely.
How do I not include Susan B. Anthony's grave or, some other really iconic, really important, meaningful resting places that people make trips from across the country to visit. But that wasn't quite what the story was. And I didn't want to kind of take the limelight away from some of these places, if that makes any sense.
Right. Oh, totally. And it actually goes back to kind of the Boot Hill thing where you were looking at, the Chinese immigrants whose stories aren't really told, or when you're looking for the enslaved people that may or may not know where they're buried and stuff, which is very refreshing for, I think, books to kind of focus on things people don't really realize about. I think you quoted in the book that you love cemeteries because they leave breadcrumbs trails to truths too often buried and forgotten. So what were some of the challenges in covering these truths and doing your research? And I know you say you're a reporter and a traveler and not necessarily a scholar, but you obviously did a lot of research and stuff. So what was the process and the challenges?
The process involved a lot of research just to kind of back up the stories, and I include the bibliography in the back that lists a lot of the sources, and just tracking down the stories, going back to copies of the New York Times from the 19th century and other ways to kind of track down the historical record, including old newspapers from the 19th century in Tombstone, Arizona, and things like that, which was fascinating, but incredibly time consuming. The greatest challenge was oftentimes when I travel to these places, it's usually on vacation or with the family, and it's getting the family to come along. Which I may have mentioned a couple of times in the book as well, that getting everyone in my family to buy into visiting cemeteries is usually involves bribery, but they appreciate it. But that's one of the challenges.
Yes. So that is one thing that people should know, that you are inserted in the book, talking about various visiting. Sometimes you're there jogging. Sometimes you're forcing your wife or child to be with you. And then the other thing is you like puns, which I'm surprised, having worked in a cemetery, we get tiresome of them, but you did a great job with putting them in and not being annoying. So the dad joke puns of dying to get in and those types of things. So that
Wow,
must have been
you're
fun to come
slaying
up with
me.
them all.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, how could I not include dad jokes? I mean,
Right.
it's part of who I am.
Yes. So, well, it was appreciated. Like I said, when some people come in and to the office and say it's not as exciting, but in the book it worked. So, so good job there.
If you want, I can throw a few dad jokes out. I've got them at the ready anytime.
Yeah.
So you
Well,
know.
I have on my questions here, which is, it was going to be sort of later, but I do have cemeteries you're dying to visit that you didn't get to. But so how many cemeteries have you visited? And they all didn't make the book, that's for sure.
No.
So is there a second book on this subject, or you're moving on, or?
Yeah, I worked. So it's estimated that there are 144,000 cemeteries in America. That means that there are 10 times as many cemeteries as there are McDonald's, or 8 times as many cemeteries or burial grounds of some kind than Starbucks locations. So I couldn't get them all. But I worked, it took a long time. I had the researcher, I've been researching pretty much since, it was probably around 2014, there was an article in the New York Times that said that urban cemeteries are running out of space. And so that really kind of sparked my interest into like how I could write about cemeteries, because in the past, as an outdoor and a travel writer, and fitness writer and that sort of thing, I was writing for magazines where they, the whole point of the magazine was like 6-pack abs or how to beat your 5K time. And it's not about death, really. So like when I would pitch cemeteries or whatever, it didn't quite go over well for those publications. And so I never really figured out how to write it. But that article in the New York Times kind of got me thinking a lot about land use and finite space that we have for burial grounds, and really what the future holds for them. And as you know, it's very difficult to maintain a perpetual care fund for a cemetery or a burial ground, especially in one that hasn't had anyone buried there for many, many generations. So I really have been researching for a really, really long time to find a way to tell the story, to find the right cemeteries to tell the story, and that aren't just interesting places that you can just say, hey, that's an interesting place to go to, but hey, this place played a role in history, or this place had an important vantage point that you can look at through history and has this full beginning and middle and end to it, and not just, hey, this is a good piece of trivia. And so although you think of 144,000 cemeteries, there are 144,000 stories at least, ones that kind of can tell the story of America through the treatment of the dead, it becomes a bit more difficult. I know that was kind of long-winded, but I wanted to kind of give context as to how I chose these specific cemeteries.
Yeah. So were there some uncompleted stories that you tried to come up and then the chapter just didn't come together because they're research?
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, go ahead.
The gorgeous places, the places that you're going to ask me at the end, the ones that I would tell people to visit or whatever, like just about any cemetery in New Orleans. And millions of people visit the cemeteries in New Orleans. And they have this interesting story to tell, but a lot of them were founded and created before they were even a part of the United States in New Orleans. And none of them quite had the right story that I could fit in and tell. And then there's Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, which is, people remember it as the cemetery that's on the cover of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And it is, I'm going to use a pun, but it's breathtaking. It really is. The way it basically all the roads on it are all sand, and it's right on the edge of a river, and these cedar trees that are covered with Spanish moss just shade the whole place, and the tombstones themselves are dissolving into the ground practically as you watch them, it seems like. And it's almost, you're watching nature take this place over. And it has this incredible history because John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club and the writer, he had actually spent like over a week camping in Bonaventure Cemetery when it was first created, when he went on one of his most famous treks on the East Coast and wrote about it. And it just has these amazing tidbits, these amazing facts to it. And I would have loved to have found a way to include that as a full-on story, but it didn't play a pivotal role in America in that way, so I couldn't include it.
So,
I just have to cut in one second. I just saw this comment here about someone's own story at a cemetery. And last night I was in Asheville, North Carolina, and I was talking about the book. It was a book event, and before I started speaking, I said, I want everyone to stop for a second and think about their own cemetery story, not one that's tragic, but I said, just as every cemetery has a story, everyone just about has a cemetery story. And my students are very well aware of my asking a question and then waiting a very long time for the awkward pause to end and someone to actually chime in. And so someone in the crowd did, they told a story about their cemetery story. And then all of a sudden it just started going around the room. And all these people had these fascinating, amazing stories about their own experiences in cemeteries. And what was great about it was that I didn't really have to talk.
Well, there you go. So speaking of that, I mean, tombstone traveling and visiting cemeteries is a thing. Not a lot of people, I'm assuming a lot of the people on this presentation are into it because they're here now, but not everybody understands it. So did you meet a lot of people in cemeteries that are out looking and about, or you were just by yourself doing your own thing and didn't even notice if there was a bunch of tourists and stuff?
I'm probably not the most loquacious. I generally don't sidle up to people, at cemeteries all that much. I kind of keep to myself for the most part, or with my family. The stories that I would get would be more from talking to the people who work at the cemeteries and that sort of thing. But I will say that when you think about the number of people who actually go to cemeteries and visit them as not necessarily paying respects to a loved one, but to visit a cemetery, 4 million people a year go to Arlington National Cemetery. 1 million people a year go to Gettysburg National Cemetery. Normandy, it's the same. The American Cemetery in Normandy, Forest Lawn Cemetery, the one that I was mentioning in California, 1 million people go there a year. So I think that that's often underestimated. I'm not sure what the statistics are, at a lot of cemeteries, other cemeteries, but I have a feeling that it exceeds what people realize. I bet more people go to Cedar Hill than to enjoy the nature and the art than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, it's hard for us to track because, people can come in and out on their own. But we definitely noticed actually an uptick during the pandemic of being a beautiful place for people to walk and experience the nature and the art. So, and we definitely, we could just tell by the number of cars parked around and people walking and stuff and being able to safely distance and stuff. So even though we had to stop our programming, still a lot of people were coming and experiencing it. And that's important to those of us that there's not a lot of us in the business of doing the tourism type and programming at cemeteries. But that's important. It's, I'm not there to sell plots. I'm there to have people experience history and beauty and stuff. So, so that's one of the positives out of the pandemic, at least for the cemetery, was people appreciating the beauty of a cemetery.
Yeah.
So onto kind of the not a pretty stuff. Besides talking about cemeteries, specific cemeteries and specific historic stories and stuff, You talk a little bit about the business and what you reference as the death industrial complex or the opportunistic funeral industry. And so obviously I might have a few differing opinions on some of it, but Cedar Hill is actually established in a time where things are a little bit different. So, but that's kind of a theme throughout. And so I don't know if you want to chat about that a little bit.
Sure. After the Civil War, kind of the capitalization of death in America came about. A lot of it had to do with the newly introduced practices of embalming that came about during the Civil War, and the profession of, at the time, undertaking. And once the Civil War was over, the focus became on a new set of clients, which was the general public. And so the need for more ornate funerals, from flowers at funerals. The first florist shop wasn't created until the late 19th century, to embalming, to upselling caskets, and that sort of thing really started to rise. And then in the 20th century, pre-selling plots, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. A cemetery, it seems like you could bring in a lot of revenue, because cemetery plots themselves can be quite expensive, and it's only a very small amount of space. Yet the challenge is, at least I mentioned this in Forest Lawn Cemetery, Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California. You need a lot of people to die to make that money. So they began a very aggressive, and I'm probably using the term mildly for aggressive, a pre-sale program of selling people on the security of eternity. And as a result of that, they had salespeople who would go door to door selling grave plots. And it became also very predatory, cemetery insurance, especially to poor and underrepresented communities who were basically sold on, you can't own land and life, but you can own this plot in death. And a lot of times these installment plans ended up being much, much more costly than the actual cost of the grave plot itself. And only very recently, the life insurance companies, a large handful of the major life insurance companies, had to pay essentially reparations for how they took advantage of underrepresented communities in the early to mid 20th century on burial insurance. And that's how they basically built these what turned into multi-billion dollar corporations. So really, I go into that quite a bit, actually. Yeah. But does that mean, does that mean that every funeral home is predatory or upselling products? No, of course not. There are a lot of good people who do a lot of good for families in need and families who need comfort. And obviously, this is in a way, I say in the prologue, this is a love story to cemeteries, right? But at the same time, I want to be kind of telling the whole story, and so I try and do that as best I can.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's probably something that a lot of people haven't thought about, and until they potentially experienced it themselves. Like I said, Cedar Hill was fortunate that I think the way we were established and everything, we don't have a lot of those issues and stuff, but I know that a lot of regulations were put into place in the late 60s, 70s, and then going forward to kind of combat some of those issues. But
Right.
it is a thread throughout the establishment of cemeteries and the undertaking business and funeral homes and the switch from parlors and such. And so that's all interwoven into the book as well.
And I see that Walter Powell just wrote a comment that, and I was going to bring this up too, Jessica Mitford's book, The American Way of Death, was so essential in ripping the lid, so to speak, off of all of this profit making and everything, and had just this massive effect on regulation in the United States.
Right. So another interesting and probably not as, I guess another sad part of it is some of the cemeteries that kind of real estate schemes to them, and particularly in New York, I think it was, and which again, most cemeteries were not established that way, of founders able to make money multiple ways, not just by selling plots. So there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle.
Yeah, and really, so I think that for a long time, just in every kind of aspect of cemeteries, as cemeteries are overlooked, people, I'm sure anyone who drives more than a couple miles to commute to work, if they get in a car to do it, they're passing a burial ground somewhere. But it largely goes unexamined. It largely goes unexamined by historians. It largely goes unexamined by environmental scientists. It largely goes unexamined by civil rights leaders. It largely goes unexamined by regulators when it comes to profit making and that sort of thing. And it largely goes unexamined by journalists. And I'm talking mostly in a lot of, as far as the profit making and the journalism was in the past, in how these cemeteries were created, and the people who were using the tax laws. And that still happens today, that people use tax laws to try and get around, because of the nonprofit status of cemeteries, to establish maybe plots on on private properties that are used for other purposes that I don't really understand, but in order to get around certain tax issues and that sort of thing. But obviously, the government is a lot more vigilant on that now.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you talk about in the book is kind of the life cycle of cemeteries. And obviously we run out of space. And so that also changes the way cemeteries are run, also changes what we offer to people. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as an environmental journalist quite a bit. And so the story of cemeteries forever has been the story of land use and how we use land, and how we go back to the earth. And it is becoming a more and more urgent issue for us because land is finite, especially urban space. But we've seen cities run out of space a long time ago. The lower Manhattan, there basically have been no burials allowed there, except for some very extreme and rare exceptions since the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, San Francisco moved every cemetery plot out of the city to Colma, California. Or if people in the city didn't actually move it, they at least got rid of the gravestones and then built over some of the cemeteries. And we see that in European cities as well. But the notion of a grave as being a so-called eternal resting place is pretty. I don't want to say it's unique to the United States, but in a lot of places, especially if you look in a lot of other places, it isn't necessarily this idea that everyone gets a headstone and everyone gets a grave plot is actually quite American. And so but things are changing now with the trend towards cremation, and now that cremations are more popular than burial. And so that a lot of cemeteries that had been grappling with the prospect of running out of room by now, including Arlington National Cemetery, including Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and some of the most famous ones that thought they would run out of space by now, have found new and creative ways to make room for people who want that to be their resting place.
Mm-hmm. And some other new trends, green burial is something that you also kind of talk about, which is, we definitely get questions of that in the industry, and not a lot of us are moving in that direction, but some have, and you found some interesting examples of that.
Yeah, so Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts was created, really kind of started the rural, as you know, the rural cemetery movement, and it was seen as the first city park in America, before, at a time when we thought of land as a place that we would, nature as something that we conquered, not preserved. And so it's funny now that they're one cemetery among the old traditional ones that is kind of investigating and offering some natural burial services. The one that I do focus on mostly is West Laurel Hill, which was modeled after Mount Auburn, similar to Cedar Hill in Philadelphia, and they have this incredibly, maybe the most natural cemetery in the country, where you're buried in a shroud. There's no stone. They allow the land to be overgrown to the point where someday trees will grow atop where the burial sites are. And now they have, I think it's goats eating the grass on top of the cemetery in order to keep it, to keep it mowed, but not to use fossil fuels to do it. And also, there can be no embalming or chemicals involved in the process. The graves, from what I understand, are dug by hand, also to lower the carbon footprint. But I think that a lot of people think about the natural burial movement, which is really important and really interesting. There are 5 states that now allow human composting, which is interesting. But I think also what's fascinating about right now is kind of the digital graveyard that is also arising. And I'll get into that. I don't want to jump too far to the side, but at some point I do want to kind of mention that as well.
Yep. Now's perfect time. Go ahead.
Okay. Well,
so that is one of your storylines. So
yes, and so I the natural burial movement is really fascinating, and I think that a lot of people are looking for low impact ways where they're not necessarily taking up a lot of space, which is really interesting and fascinating, and is really a great trend. And then I think that one of the things that drives that is that once upon a time, putting up a gravestone and having a plot for yourself at a traditional cemetery was a way of kind of ensuring immortality, ensuring that you're going to be remembered in some way. But a gravestone only has so much data, right? Facebook has a lot more data on your life and on your memory. So that changes how you look at how you're going to be remembered and what you want with your body. If you think of a cemetery as being a place that keeps the essence of your life and memorializes you, then Facebook is the largest cemetery in the world. It has 30 million, the accounts of 30 million people who have passed away. And I think that in 50 years, there will be more people dead than alive on Facebook. And so that changes the calculus so much for how people want to be remembered, what they want with their body, as opposed to, and yet how they can still be memorialized. I think that also kind of drives people to be more open to natural burials.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things from the book was the cemetery that you had talked about that pre-Facebook was trying to do digital remembrances, and unfortunately didn't get as far along, and obviously not a free platform like Facebook became that. But that's interesting. I had no idea that the cemetery was thinking that far ahead.
Right, and that was basically the turn of the century. So there was MySpace at that time, but there was no Facebook, and they were trying to create basically what was a Facebook. They wanted to create this page where people could put posts and pictures and remember people. And yeah, the problem was they were trying to charge people for it, which is not that there's anything wrong with that, but they wanted a fee-based service to do it, and they were getting people to do it. They were putting up videos of the people who were buried there, and they had a web page for that, and pages for each of the individuals, and they were the people who owned and still own Hollywood Forever Now, who had just recently bought it, and at that time, and were trying to kind of find the new way of death in America. They wanted to expand that to colleges, that their Facebook, and they didn't quite get there, but they were in Money Magazine. They were like all these different publications. It wasn't like a secret. It wasn't like they were just doing this on the side. There were all these national publications that were playing it up and saying, hey, these people are doing really interesting things, but they didn't quite get there. And then Facebook came up and did essentially the same thing a couple of years later. It's kind of interesting.
Yes. All right. So I did read some reviews of your book on Goodreads and stuff. And so in one of the things somebody said, they were so amazed. They did not know graves are not 6 feet deep. So that's one of the things you kind of talk about, some myths there that were out there. And so I don't know if there's anything else that pops out that you think might surprise people that they don't realize about cemeteries.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think basically what I tried to do through my research and reporting was make it so that every page was a surprise. Like every page you would open up and say, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was kind of the birthplace of a landscape architecture or suburban subdivisions. I didn't know about digital immortality, or the like you mentioned before, the record that is kept in the boot hills of the West of the contributions of the Chinese immigrant to America, and these sort of things. It's hard for me to really put the finger on one, but I would say that the biggest surprise to me, I guess, through my own naivete, was just how, in many places, the racial segregation of the dead continues. Continues. It's not just a record of the past, but it's a prism or a lens into the present as well. And I'm not saying this is widespread or everywhere, obviously, but or casting aspersions on all cemeteries, obviously, but as a reflection of our country, I thought that was the most poignant.
And I did check the New York Times review as well. And I thought I was just going to quote from it because I think it's a good description so that our audience should know and encourage them to purchase the book. But it mentions that the book is a work of cultural and material history, how people were buried, how the living marked death, and a social history. What does the act of memorializing, who is remembered and who is left out, tell us about how people lived, what they valued, and what we live now, the way we live now. So I think that pretty much sums it up, is that, you're looking at the past, but you're also kind of bringing back up into the present and, what we value now compared to then. And, it's not a straight history. It's not a tour guide. It's a little bit of everything. So. Yeah,
and I know that we want to open up to questions from the audience, but
yes.
That's it. You've done a great job kind of segueing to my conclusion, and not to give anything away in the book, but ultimately the aim of the book is to have us. I want it to be meaningful. I wanted to have us examine how we live our lives, right? By looking at how we memorialize and treat the dead. It tells us so much about ourselves, not just in the past, but in the present. And really, what is important is how we live our lives and for whom. And that's what I do try and get across in the book. And hopefully I try and get that across in the book.
Yes. So I don't know if Omar wants to pop back on to handle our Q&A. If he's
Sure.
out there. There he is.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and combine 2 questions.
Do any involve dad jokes?
We like your dad
No,
jokes.
unfortunately not. Yeah. Hey, I like the dad jokes and the puns. Right. So I'm gonna combine 2 questions, one from Sharon and one from Stephen. because Sharon asks two things, and I think you answered one of them. She asked how many cemeteries you visited, um, and I think you answered that. But she also asks, did you visit any outside of the U.S.? And then Stephen asks, did you visit the cemetery in the cemeteries in Forest Park? The city of or town of Forest Park says that it has more dead people resting in cemeteries there than living people who live in the city. Yeah.
Let me see. So I will say, I'm just looking up. So we're talking Forest Park,
Illinois.
Illinois. Okay.
Mhm.
No, not really. I've and then as far as the overseas, yeah, I mean, the American military cemeteries overseas. A lot of, when I travel overseas, I check out cemeteries, and I do describe Père Lachaise in Paris, of course, because it was so instrumental in the design of cemeteries in the United States. I've been to Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, which is an amazing cemetery, but I haven't spent a lot of time in the Chicago area, so I really haven't done enough investigating there.
Maybe in the future.
Yeah. For sure.
Keith asks, what was your parameters for picking a particular cemetery? And I imagine for the book.
Yeah, it had to really closely reflect on a certain era, or it had to influence a certain moment of time in American history. So, for instance, like I mentioned, Gettysburg in Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington National Cemetery was created largely in order to for the Union to thumb their nose at Robert E. Lee, because it was built on his wife's property, essentially his property, and the first bodies that were buried around his home so that he could never live there again. And it was really kind of a symbol to the Confederacy at that time when it was built. And Arlington National Cemetery's role, as well as Gettysburg's role in assigning the good death to military personnel who die in battle, really changed our perspective on war and sacrifice for the country. And then you can look at other cemeteries like the one in Concord, Mass, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, which was a conservation project, or Forest Lawn Cemetery, Memorial Park in Los Angeles, which changed the business of death that we still feel today. Mount Auburn, which we've mentioned, was the birthplace of urban parks, which led to green spaces around the country. Central Park itself was kind of basically Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn was so popular as a tourist destination that people decided, oh, well, we should build this Central Park in New York and in Manhattan, and we'll just do it without graves. And in Central Park itself is a resting place for many people in different eras, including today as a popular place for people to scatter cremated ashes. So I'm kind of going on, but each one of these places has some kind of an important story to tell that is interwoven very tightly with American history, and that's how I chose them specifically.
Great answer to that question. We're getting a lot of questions about, I'm trying to synthesize them all together, but we're getting a lot of questions about green burial.
Yeah.
And I mean, I tweeted out to you that that's my own preferred way to go.
Yeah.
And I'll say it publicly, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
But a lot of people are asking about is that really a trend that we'll be seeing in the future? Is it really more sustainable than our standard burial practices right now. Trying to capture all the things that I saw.
Yeah. So yes, and yes, and yes, and yes. So even take cremation, for example, which is considered lower impact, perhaps, in a lot of regards than traditional burial, and that has, according to people who calculate these things, supposedly that has the carbon footprint of driving a car 1,000 miles. But a natural burial where you don't have any chemicals used in the process, where you don't have any expensive caskets or a vault, so you're not using any of those materials or putting treated wood into the ground or anything like that, the carbon footprint is significantly lower. And so is it a trend? It sure seems that way, as more, for instance, California just moved forward, further forward in their goal to make human composting available. And that, just having a state as massive as California move toward that as an option is huge in this trend. And so, yes, I absolutely do, as people become more concerned with how much space they take up and what resources they use when they are buried, as well as the attitude toward how to be memorialized and how to remain remembered in perpetuity, right? Which is kind of what I get back to with digital memorialization. But who's to say? I can't look into the future, but it sure seems that I know that when I talk like tonight, it is by far the number one question that people ask about, without a doubt.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I think.
some people. Oh yeah, Beverly.
Yeah, Beverly.
Oh, sorry. I was just say your book brought up some of the issues with green burial, though, of spacing. How many, like, if you're going to put, you can get 1,000 people in an acre in the traditional way, but green burial you usually only do 100. So then you need even more land. So there's still things to be worked out, I think, and you kind of go over a lot of that in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a nature preserve in South Carolina, which is amazing. It's basically a nature preserve that has bodies in it, and they're so interspersed. The human population under the ground is so small compared to the size of the preserve that it wouldn't be sustainable for any place where land is expensive. For instance, so there do need, it's all about land use and space again.
Yeah, and I've also seen questions in the chat in the Q&A. This makes me think about my own stories with cemeteries, where my family's from Puerto Rico. I grew up here in New England, and something very similar that I've seen in both places that have very different cultures is the forgottenness of cemeteries because of shifts in migrations. And so there are a lot of questions about how do we protect our cemeteries? How do we look after, cemeteries that, I think you've said this earlier, where nobody has been buried there for many generations.
Yes. And there are some places where their perpetual care funds are pretty impressive, that some cemeteries have managed to really include their communities in order to maintain their presence and their relevance beyond the fact that the space is dwindling, right? And so that they are these places of culture and history that last, that attract people long beyond that. But for the most part, they aren't, right? So in a lot of cases, a lot of old cemeteries become the responsibility and the domain of a local municipality, who then the taxpayers must pay for it. But what is what you notice when you look at this is the unevenness of how cemeteries are preserved, right? So, for instance, a small fraction of the 6 million people who died while enslaved from 1619 onward until emancipation, a small fraction of those burial grounds exist in our knowledge today, right? And so you find that cemeteries, largely from underrepresented communities, are often the ones that are the first to undergo the bulldozer, because there isn't a well-heeled group of people who are in power who are fighting for this cemetery. So it becomes more, or the municipalities never bring those cemeteries, those burial grounds, under protection. And the amount of money is minuscule, for instance, that goes from states or even local municipalities for enslaved people's burial grounds. So, I don't know the answer necessarily when a city runs out of space and what they should do for a cemetery where no one has been buried for a long time. But I think that it's really important that we understand that the ones that there's been a lot of erasure over the last couple of centuries, and that has largely been the predominant way that cemeteries have been removed. I'm kind of talking around that a little bit, but it's a challenging subject. And you look at one person's sacred burial ground now, thousands of years from now, is another person's archaeological dig. But kind of the disregard that we've had for the certain cemeteries that we've allowed to be removed or built over, there's a very clear pattern of who it is, whether it's indigenous people or enslaved people, and that sort of thing.
Maybe a slight detour from this serious subject. Do you have any thoughts about cemeteries for our non-human companions? Is that anything that you did research on or considered?
I didn't. I can tell you, we still have we still have a couple of our pets with us that in urns on our bookshelf that we haven't scattered, but I haven't done any research on pet cemeteries.
And perhaps we'll end on a lighter question. This might be difficult to do off the cuff, but let's see if you can handle it. What do you want written on your tombstone? Please answer in the form of a pun or a dad joke.
Okay, well, then
that's from Anna.
Well, there's one in Tombstone, Arizona. My name is not Les Moore, but I think it. What was his? It was something like a poor old Les Moore, no less, no more. I like that one. But for me, I don't know. I don't think that there's going to be one. I don't think there's going to be an epitaph. I can tell a dad joke, but it won't be a punny one. It won't be one for my. I'm sorry, for my epitaph. I probably will go in a more natural way.
Great. Someone wrote that theirs would say, "Wish you were here."
I like that.
I think we will close it out with that. Maybe leave on a high note for this topic. But I'm getting a lot of comments in the chat about how fantastic this discussion was, and I will agree with that. Thank you so much, Beverly and Greg. And I have not read the book yet, but I will definitely be reading it. Thank you all our audience as well for joining us this evening. If you joined us late or want to go back and rewatch the program, you can do so on our YouTube channel. I will be uploading that tomorrow, so you'll be able to catch that. I will drop a link to our YouTube in the chat. Please open that up and bookmark it so you can watch it tomorrow. Also, you can subscribe so you can get notifications that we've uploaded videos. And also find our upcoming events as well. We will have an event next week about mortuary science. So we'll definitely be along this theme. Once again, thanks so much to Greg and Beverly, and I wish you all a good evening.
Thanks, Beverly.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone at the Mark Twain House. This was fantastic. And thanks everyone for showing up and listening.